The Nova Kakhovka Dam is the largest reservoir in Ukraine in terms of volume. It is one of the main geographic features of southern Ukraine, 240 kilometers long and up to 23 kilometers wide. It is the last of the cascade of 6 Soviet-era dams on the Dnipro River, a major waterway running through southeastern Ukraine. There are multiple towns and cities downstream, including Kherson, a city of some 300,000 people before Moscow's invasion of its neighbor. The Ukrainian military intelligence said that explosion occurred at 2:50 a.m. local time on Tuesday, when Russian terrorists carried out an internal explosion of the structures of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant. Around 16,000 people on the west bank of the Kherson region are in the critical zone. The country's President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Telegram that there were about 80 settlements on the flood zone and that he has ordered evacuations. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba accused Russia of blowing up the southern Ukrainian dam in a deliberate and long-planned terrorist act after a breach sent vast amounts of water downstream, flooding settlements and swatches of land. He said areas downstream from the dam had already suffered tremendous damage and warned of the long-term and irreversible harm to ecosystems in Ukraine and the Black Sea, describing it as an ecocide.
In the early hours of June 6, 2023, Russian forces blew up the Kakhovka Dam in the occupied territory in the south of Ukraine. This massive concrete structure held 18.3 cubic kilometers of water. The civilian population and the environment downstream of the Dnipro River are already suffering tremendous damage as a result of floods. President Zelensky immediately convened the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. Ukrainian law enforcement and emergency services are working hard to mitigate the consequences and save lives. Ukraine calls an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council and brings the issue of the Russian Terrorist Act to the International Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors. We will also cooperate with the EU Civil Protection Mechanism and other international mechanisms to mitigate consequences and bring Russia to account. In light of developments on the battlefield, Russia's deliberate and long-planned terrorist act turned the man-made flood into a weapon. The harm to the environment is of particular concern. Entire ecosystems are facing long-term and irreversible harm because of the floods. Animals in the Nova Kakhovka Zoo have already died in the rising water, and this is only the beginning of harm for fauna in the south of Ukraine, along the Dnipro River and in the Black Sea. We are witnessing ecocide on a regional, not just Ukrainian scale. We call on all governments and international organizations to condemn Russia's actions and support President Zelensky's peace formula. Its items, prevention of ecocide, nuclear safety and energy safety, are all highly relevant right now. The Kakhovka disaster is yet another proof that Russia is a terrorist state. Every country, parliament and international organization should recognize Russia as such, without delay. We also call on the EU and G7 member states to impose new, devastating sanctions on Russia, including its missile industry and atomic energy sphere. Russia will be held accountable for the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam and other crimes.
The United Nations Security Council will meet later on Tuesday to discuss the dam at the request of both Russia and Ukraine. Attacks against civilians and critical civilian infrastructure must stop. We must act to ensure accountability and respect for international humanitarian law, said Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations.
We have all seen the tragic images coming out today of the monumental humanitarian, economic and ecological catastrophe in the Kherson region of Ukraine. The United Nations has no access to independent information on the circumstances that led to the destruction of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant dam. But one thing is clear. This is another devastating consequence of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we are seeing the effects in the city of Kherson, the town of Nova Kakhovka, and 80 other towns and villages along the Dnipro River. Massive flooding, large-scale evacuations, environmental devastation, destruction of newly planted crops. and added threats to the highly threatened Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest nuclear facility. At least 16,000 people have already fled their homes, lost their homes, with safe and clean drinking water supplies at risk for many thousands more. The United Nations and the humanitarian partners are rushing support in coordination with the government of Ukraine, including drinking water and a water purification tablet and other critical assistance. We will continue our humanitarian work and our appeals for urgent, safe and secure humanitarian access. Today's tragedy is yet another example of the horrific price of war on people. The floodgates of suffering have been overflowing for more than a year, and that must stop. Attacks against civilians and critical civilian infrastructure must stop. And we must act to ensure accountability and respect for international humanitarian law. Above all, I appeal for a just peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and the resolutions of the General Assembly. And I thank you.
According to the Security Council meeting request, Ukraine accused Russia of an ecological and technological act of terrorism, while Russia described it as an act of sabotage carried out by Ukraine.